Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today we will hear from topic experts on what they have to say about threat assessment within the cloud and how the executive order has impacted agencies' cloud security practices. My name is Kirsten Patton and I'm the Working Group Program Manager here at ATARC, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and we are a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I would like to welcome all of our attendees and give a special thanks to Palo Alto Networks for helping us put together today's webinar. Before we begin, I just want to encourage the audience to please submit questions of your own in the Q&A section of this platform. And also remember to answer any of the poll questions if you would like to receive your CPE credit. And now I would like if each of our panelists could go around and introduce yourself and provide a little bit of background about what you've been up to and why you're here today. So let's start with Paul, please.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks to ATARC as well. Great to be here. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at the U.S. Department of Labor, and I've been doing that job for about 3.5 years. Beyond that, and this is incredible for me to believe right now, over 30 years in IT. I must have started when I was like 12 or something. I don't know what it is. And 10 of those in cyber, or a little over 10 of those in cyber. And to give the audience a little bit of context, a little bit about Department of Labor, if they don't know. Our mission is to foster, promote, and develop welfare of job seekers, wage earners, and retirees. We want to improve working conditions and assure work-related benefits and rights. Now, within the Department of Labor, I'm in the Office of the Chief Information Officer, or OCIO. And there, it's our job. We act as a customer service organization. We provide IT solutions to enable mission work by way of collaboration and innovation. And the cyber piece of that is to make sure that those critical services are not disrupted or compromised due to a cyber threat. And because this is about cloud, I should point out that we have a large and growing portfolio of cloud solutions, whether that's software as a service like email or case management, or it's platform as a service more where we're building things on top of something else provided in the cloud, mission-specific applications there. Now, seeing that these are secure is paramount, of course, for my job. Top of mind right now are things like executive order items, of course, as well as the sort of continuing churn of identifying and remediating threats. To learn more about what IT is doing at DOL, I'm going to give a plug for our social media. We have a Twitter that's at OCIO_DOL, and we also have a LinkedIn page. Once again, thanks for the opportunity to join you in your discussion today.
Absolutely, thank you. And we will move over to Dr. Anderson next.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, ATARC, for allowing me to participate in this panel today. My name is Lawrence Anderson. I have two roles at the Department of Commerce. One as the CIO for the Office of the Secretary at the Department of Commerce. We have multiple bureaus, and I'm also the Deputy CIO and responsible for essentially shared services or enterprise services at the Department of Commerce. So anything that's enterprise, like financial systems, HR systems, or ICAM or identity management systems would come under my purview. I'm here today. I've been doing this, I guess, at the Department of Commerce for about 2 years. Before that, I was at the Office of Personnel Management for about 5 years, where I ran essentially the public-facing and internally facing, all of the internally facing and public-facing applications that have to do with the life cycle of human resources for the federal government. So we call it hire to retire. So any onboarding systems like USA Jobs, if any of you guys out there who apply for a job, you're familiar with it, USA Staffing, USA Hire, the background investigations systems that you get used to get clearances, And also at the end of your process, the retirement process, when people start to, begin to retire from the federal service or from the military, it is often the personnel management that conducts all those transactions. The other part of the role is also there's quite a big presence in IT as it pertains to your healthcare and the enrollment for healthcare participants in the federal government. That's all also OPM. So it's a small to mid-sized organization, has a really big platform, and it has a huge reach. So I've been there for 5 years. So what I've been doing lately, or for the last 2 years, is really to try to deal with our technical debt and implement, some enterprise capabilities for the department that just had not been there. We are a federated organization, and we are doing our best to try to centralize and standardize on one or two or three platforms rather than 7 or 8 or 9. And as a shared service provider, even the solutions, the cyber solutions that we will be implementing as it pertains to Zero Trust will be my team implementing those. In the CISA organization, we kind of organize in a way that they are also a customer for me as well. So I provide services to them. And so the solutions that we build out to enable Zero Trust, identity management, CDM, all will be things that I will be deploying for the department. So that's all I have for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And then over to Matt.
Awesome. Well, Kirsten, thanks for having us here today. I love the stuff that HR puts together, and it's always good to have these discussions. So I'm currently at Palo Alto Networks as the Chief Security Officer for all things cloud. I've been here for about 3.5 years, came here by way of acquisition. Prior to that, I was at IT services conglomerate Cognizant Technology Solutions, CTS, where I was the global head of cloud security, really working, this is a fairly large organization with over 300,000 associates worldwide. And my role there as the global head of cloud security was really helping the organization to put together some original policies, procedures, and standards around how we could go to cloud, how we could leverage this capability and do it securely. So my role at Palo Alto now is as Chief Security Officer. I spend a lot of my time with customers, both public and private, helping them to kind of often realize the vision of the CIO, which is, hey, we're going to go to the cloud. But now the question is how do we do that securely? How do we get visibility? So I spend a lot of my time working with customers directly, but also with our Unit 42 research team, leading some of our cloud threat research efforts. So that's what keeps me busy.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for those introductions. And now we'll just continue in that same order, but I'll go ahead and pose the first question to Paul. Paul, how has your agency responded, or what are your plans to respond to the executive order when it comes to improving the nation's cybersecurity, specifically as it relates to the cloud?
Well, that's a really narrow question. Thanks for asking that. So, as I was thinking about that previously, because of the topic of this, the executive order itself actually reaches out, I think, and drives some federal IT to the cloud. In fact, I think there's a line in it somewhere about accelerating movement to a secure cloud is part of the direction in the executive order. And then I believe all the other things in the executive order sort of wrap around that for cloud. There is a significant portion that's about relationship with vendors, right? How should that be enhanced in this modern environment where security is so important? For instance, getting common contract provisions across the federal civilian space, which I think is going to be a big benefit, not only to federal agencies to be able to have some common provisions put in contracts about security, but also for the vendor. I mean, I doubt that they want 23 to 30 different versions of requirements coming down from federal agencies. So if they can get a common set of things that they know they need to comply with, whether it's things about, threat, vulnerability, or incident reporting, back through to the federal government, or it's about that applying zero trust principles to their environments so that's what we're buying, or it's about having a secure supply chain within their environment, including things like a software bill of materials. And also the logging requirements that are on federal agencies, according to the executive order, also apply to our partners that we're contracted with. So I think that there's a lot of things in the executive order that both drive security to the cloud, but also help federal agencies in a common way embrace that.
Great. Thank you. And Dr. Anderson, would you like to respond to that one as well?
So I think, let me make sure could you restate the question, because I lost train of thought. I was reading the second one, but I want to make sure I answer appropriately.
Yeah, of course. So I was just asking about how your agency has responded, or if you have plans to respond to the EO when it comes to improving cybersecurity for the cloud.
And so, so this is, so on a tactical level, we can definitely talk about tactics that we use, but I really want to talk strategy now. And it's really about us as a policy matter dealing with how we're going to implement it. So CISA has provided their guidance, the OMP has provided their executive order. And so the way it generally works in the federal sector is that we get a memo from the OMB saying to the department and to the CIO, what rules are you going to put in place to implement this at the department? And for a department of 47,000 users and 12 different bureaus with 12 different CIOs, it's quite a bit to try to, to filter that down, to write the appropriate policies that work across the board. So that's, the largest lift of this is not the technology in my mind. It's really about the policy itself and the governance of how we're going to do this at the department level when we were such a, a federated, environment. So the biggest challenge that we're dealing with right now is just that. Okay, what is our policy going to be, and how are we going to govern zero trust across essentially a federated environment? Which I think it's a whole talk. We can have a conversation just about that alone and spend all day to talk about. But that's one of the huge challenges that we're dealing with. I think Homeland Security likely, and Department of Defense and Health and Human Services, those large agencies will likely be in the same boat. But so to be direct to your question, it's really about policies, what we're dealing with. Clearly, some things in place. I think your second question is coming up. That's going to get into the more tactical things, but on a strategic level, it's really about policy and governance, which drives the technology.
Great. Thank you for your responses. So, Matt, you come from a little bit of a different angle since you're with industry, and Paul mentioned relationships with vendors enhanced. So how would you like to respond to that question from the industry standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think I can tell you that from a federal customer perspective, that after this EO came out, we saw a noticeable uptick in interest in both, some of our recent threat research around supply chain flaws, right? Because that's really what, part of what drove this, right? What happened with SolarWinds and the Kaseya breaches, things like that. The bottom line with these types of risks is that, supply chain flaws, they're really difficult to detect, right? We've learned that now. And one of the things that we talk about in some of our latest threat research is our researchers were able to leverage misconfigurations in a customer's cloud software development environment. And what this allowed them to essentially do is to control the customer's entire software development process in the cloud. And with the level of access that the researchers were able to gain, they could control the flow of software. And had they not been security researchers, they could have performed a supply chain style of attack. And they were able to carry this out because they were able to exploit process gaps and critical security flaws, like things like hard-coded credentials, right? These are the types of things they found and are actually quite common in cloud environments. And probably the most surprising thing that came out of that research is that the team was able to do these things in as little as 3 days, right? This wasn't something that took them, months and months to do. So I think what this goes to show is that, and I guess what I didn't say is that, this customer that the researchers carried this out upon at their request was a large SaaS provider, right? So this is a large organization serving many different companies. And it really just goes to show how even mature security programs can have operational security gaps that leave them open to potential cloud native supply chain attacks. So I think, the executive order, as Dr. Anderson said, and Paul said as well, is I think for agencies, there's quite a bit of work to do. And it's unfortunately, it's not something that's going to be solved by either buying a single technology, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, right? This is largely for many organizations and agencies. This is going to be something that is very heavy on the people and the policy side.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So since you mentioned SolarWinds and Kaseya, Dr. Anderson, I'll turn it over to you first this time, since you alluded to the next question, which is, when it comes to software supply chain security and these recent attacks we just mentioned, how are you applying or looking to apply zero trust principles to your cloud applications?
Yeah, so I would say this is not, we were already going down the road anyway. And this is, it's part of our strategy even before the executive order. But what it does do, and I'm actually glad that we have an executive order now, and not that I'm happy about the Kaseya attacks or the supply chain issue with SolarWinds, but boy, does it make it real what we were talking about in the first place. When you see these kinds of things happening and people are watching stuff on the news on ransomware attacks, when we know things. I'm sure Matt and Paul have been studying stuff for years, and they know that's their job. That's our job, to study risk and show the risk in terms of why you need to make these investments in zero trust, why you need to make investments in cybersecurity. But man, it just doesn't get real to people until it actually happens in war. But it did happen this year in a major way, particularly with the ransomware things. And it's not related, but still it's very important because clearly on the technology side, clearly going toward the zero trust thing would have helped with the SolarWinds attacks, at least in our scenario, because of course we were relying on perimeter security, right? And of course the whole concept is once you get past the perimeter, you can get to everything. And so you got to have zero trust for that reason. That would have helped us. So that's clear. That would have helped us regardless of whether you're on-prem or in the cloud. But the key thing is, just this awareness of why it's so important and why we got to do this to get the funds invested. And so we do have some funds that we will be allocating, and we got some additional help from Congress on that. That's important to the federal government because nothing moves without Congress saying, hey, yeah, verily, we get this, we understand, and we're going to provide you some resources to make this happen. So unfortunately, unfortunately that thing happened, but fortunately it did provide focus to our leadership and I say the leadership, the top leadership across the government, and of course at our leadership at the Department of Commerce, to focus on this area as being in need. And our goal, and my goal as a leader, is to make sure we don't lose focus because, just like anything else, you move on to the next thing, right? And then we've been there and done that. That was last year's thing. No, it's real, and it's, and it's an ever-present threat. And so hopefully we don't lose focus on the need for us to do this thing and see it all the way through.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to respond to that question or anything that Dr. Anderson just mentioned?
Yeah, first, one thing that Dr. Anderson mentioned that like one of the last things he may have said just reminded me that while an individual zero trust enabling technology may go out of style quickly, right? It's like, well, that's not going to work anymore. The principles behind zero trust, I think, do have a long lifespan of strong identity and authentication. I think those are going to have legs. Micro segmentation, so that if you do get compromised, right? Zero trust doesn't mean you won't ever get compromised necessarily, but it does mean it's going to isolate it down to a much smaller component of your environment and keep it there, right? You're not going to have the lateral movement or the ability to do the lateral movement because every transaction after maybe that initial compromise is going to be challenged, right? Is this a valid connection being asked for? Is this normal? Is this from someone I trust, from somewhere I trust? So it's really to, again, not necessarily prevent the initial compromise, but to prevent it from spreading. Now, I think you do take this out maybe and abstract it too, and maybe Matt can address this a little bit from a vendor standpoint. But as we work in partnership with our vendors, our key software vendors, and work with them to say, hey, you should also be adopting these principles if you haven't already. That can help us not get compromised in the first place. Because as Matt mentioned, right, you look at something like SolarWinds, not taking them as a specific example, maybe calling them out specifically, but as sort of a vendor example, was there things they could have done to prevent and realize that they had gotten an initial compromise and not have it spread through something like zero trust? So if we're able to encourage our key partners to also adopt a zero trust strategy for their environments that then we rely on to provide us with key software and services, I think we're going to be in a better position.
Yeah, I love that. I think Paul, I don't know if, I'm sorry if you weren't done, but I was going to say on your point, I love how you said that you can have zero trust fully implemented. It doesn't guarantee you're not going to have a breach somewhere, right? So I think that's a great point, right? I think there's also an assumption out there that, hey, if I do this zero trust thing, I'm not going to ever have any security issues again, right? And yeah, I can see Dr. Anderson. I know you want to say something about that.
Just going back to the SolarWinds, remembering this time last year, or when this thing hit, I remember how much time we spent trying to figure out the size of the problem and trying to segment or micro segment the problem, and we couldn't because we don't have zero trust in place. And that's where a lot of federal agencies and private sector companies are. It took a lot more time to actually get to the bottom of where our problems really are. And so having zero trust, you're right, Paul, it's absolutely right. It doesn't prevent you from having any of these issues. We're going to get hacked again. Boy, does it, it decreases the time we can actually focus on where the attack vector actually is and do something about it. That's why it's really important. And to Paul's point, us also, this is about technology, but it's also about not losing focus because, the politics of it and just the way, there's the next hot thing that comes along. There's a new Congress that may come in place and we moved on to the next thing. And that's the risk here. Of zero trust is not that once we know what to do, but having the the resources necessary to enable this, the governance, because I talked about the governance before and how it's so important, if people just think this is a technology problem and kind of wash their hands of it, that's going to be a problem. We have to bring this and have it be built in as a part of our organization, our very being from henceforth, and that has to stay and that has to stick. The governance part of this has to stick. The zero trust principles and the whole reason why we got into it has to stick. And so that's where leadership comes into play to make that stick beyond the technology.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting, right? So if you look at zero trust as a concept, right, not as a technology, it's actually a very kind of simple idea, but it is difficult to implement, right? And it's definitely possible to operationalize. Kind of the history of it, if you look at zero trust, so there was a gentleman by the name of John Kindervag who came up with a concept. I think he was an analyst at Forrester at the time when he came up with it. The first company, as far as I know, to actually fully operationalize zero trust was Google. Okay, so Google had what they called their BYOD Corp, and you can Google BYOD Corp, all one word, and there's lots of case studies that are out there on this. But they really had 3 core principles for their BYOD Corp. And I think these all still stand today. This was done years ago. Number 1 was that, access to services must not be determined by the network from which you connect, right? So zero trust totally throws out the concept of trusted and untrusted networks. Everything is considered untrusted. There's no access is given by default because you're coming from a quote unquote trust network. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 was access to services are granted based on contextual factors from the user and their device. So basically, hey, Dr. Lawrence is connecting from this laptop. What's the status of the laptop? Does it have all the latest patches? Is it running the latest malware protection, et cetera, right? Is he connecting from a known geolocation, et cetera? All those types of things fall into that second principle. And then the third principle that Google used with their BYOD Corp was they said that access to services must be authenticated, authorized, and encrypted, right? So those three key areas. And I think the encryption piece is also one that a lot of times is left out when you're talking about zero trust, but part of zero trust also involves a very big aspect of privacy. And so when you kind of apply those concepts to the software supply chain in the cloud, it really means moving away from the assumption that most software is secure by default, right? Because that's been a big assumption for a long time. We know from our latest cloud threat report that when it comes to, for example, open source software, which is heavily being used both in public and private organizations, our researchers found that the majority of it, so 64% of the most downloaded modules, resulted in at least one high or critical insecure configuration. So most of what's being downloaded from public internet sources like the Terraform registry and things like that have very poor configurations. And many application developers are starting from these templates and then introduce them into sensitive environments without any type of security review. So zero trust comes into play here, obviously, with the concept of shift left, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about later, but it's really about, getting security as close as possible to your developers and making sure all those connections are authenticated, authorized, and encrypted.
Great, thank you. We had one audience member type in, based on the concept of zero trust, does that defeat the idea of BYOD and working from home?
I think it might be BYOD.
Yeah, I was
right?
No, I'm BYOB in it. It's after lunch.
That's off camera. That's over here off camera.
So I'd say no to that. Absolutely not. And I think, and we've been talking about this internally, and over some other groups I'm involved in. I know we kind of went away from BYOD a few years ago and started going to, a government issued or a company issued device, and that's the only way you can do business. But kind of COVID changed all that, right? March 2020, it changed the ball game. We need to rethink that. And again, rethink the fact that the way that people actually work, and we want a mobile, environment. Do we actually want it? We had supply chain issues with people trying to buy phones and buy laptops, and we're still having those issues. Boy, wouldn't it be better if we could just give people a stipend and let them buy their own devices, but secure them, right? If we're authenticating them and authorizing them and encrypting, like Matt said, with everything that they do, why do we actually need to provide the government devices anymore? So we have to rethink that, and kind of go full circle back to that BYOD type thing. Obviously, we're doing it in a more secure manner than we've done it before, but I think it's very much in play when we get to zero trust, the concept of BYOD.
Well, I agree. It's open for conversation, right? But as Matt said, part of what our risk calculation is about how much do we trust the device, right? That's still going to be part of the equation. So it does come down to how much am I able to either get visibility into the device, and they may not like what I see then and tell them you can't come in, right? Your configuration isn't up to standards. You don't have whatever endpoint detection and response on there. But I wonder if we'll also struggle with it's their device, but now I'm controlling some of it, right? Because I want to put EDR on it. I want to put monitoring software on it. I want to do all of these things. So short point I would make is, yes, I think it does open it up for part of the conversation, but it's not a binary, right? Like, yes, we're going to allow it, or no, we're not. It would be a yes, but for me. Yes, we can allow it, but there has to be all of these things where we either, at minimum, have visibility, but at most that we have some control over a VM within their device or whatever that then we can say is trustworthy to come in and do certain things with applications.
Yeah, I would agree. I would to the question, does zero trust defeat the concept of BYOD and working from home? I agree with what Paul said, right? It's all about trust at the end of the day, right? Just because it's, someone's iPhone or their Android, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be trusted, but you still need to do some type of interrogation, right, on the device to make sure, well, is it in fact trustworthy? I'm sure it was the day it came, from the factory. But what else do they have running on there, right? That may have compromised the device. So I think this is where we kind of get into, I think, the technology part of it, right? Are there technologies that can offer, adaptive access, right? Like, hey, you're coming from a device and perhaps I can't verify all the things I want to verify. Well, in that case, you're not going to get full access to the environment. You may get some kind of limited, view only into it. So to that question, I know it definitely does not defeat BYOD or work from home. In fact, I think that in the long run, and we are still very early on in the game with zero trust, right? I think in the long run, it's going to cause the proliferation of it because we'll have better ways to allow that, which are really still in development today.
All right, well, there you have it. Good question and good answers. So let's pop up poll number 1, please. Poll number 1 asks, does your agency leverage more than one cloud service provider? So if you want to receive your CPE credit, make sure that you answer poll number 1. Okay, moving on to Lodge 4J. Paul, maybe we'll have you cover this one first, but the CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has renewed calls for SBOM, which is the Software Bill of Materials, in order to aid in system visibility and inventory management. Where might you see this fitting into your larger cloud security strategy?
Good, thanks for picking me. So a couple things came to mind here, and the first one was that as federal agencies or as any kind of reputable organization, right, we have a responsibility to protect the data and services where whoever hosts them and wherever they're at. We can't contract away that responsibility. So first point is we are still responsible for this, for our data and services wherever they are. And I can only adequately protect those data and services if I know what to protect. And I know the risk environment. So I have to know, I have an obligation to know how that is being protected when it's in a cloud service provider. And if that means I need a software bill of materials about how they built their solution that I am using, that is part of what I need to know. This transparency that we're asking for is needed to inspire a trusted relationship with that vendor. We can't continue to rely on that vendor if we don't have that trust relationship.
Dr. Anderson, I saw you nodding your head earlier. Do you have anything you'd like to respond with?
No, just to add to that, and I was going to go in a different direction, but Paul, got me thinking about what it means now for us to actually have this responsibility of looking at the bill of materials and looking closely at what the vendors, the softwares and service vendors are providing, and whether our agreements allow for us to do that. This is, it gets into the contractual. I mean, we're dealing with now, where, hey, you can't see that. That's our thing, right? And it's the same thing with, we do supply chain risk assessments, but we don't quite do it as much with the software as a service vendors, and maybe we should. We don't enforce so much, how often they're providing logs to us, and whether or not the SOC team actually has access to those logs in a real-time manner to be able to assess in real time the status of our environment, which now includes, a multi-cloud environment, which I think the poll pretty much said, right? We, the CISO, people like Paul are in charge of making sure we are secure across the board. And we have to have relationships. We have to actually have a staff knowledgeable enough to be able to monitor that, not just from a technical perspective, but also contractually. You got to have people who understand acquisition-wise, how do you write these things into your statements of work and performance workstations, so you can ensure that you can actually, compel your vendors to actually provide that information to you when you need it. because that was an issue we ran into with awkward, with some of our providers. Hey, we never did that before. We can't give you that. This is the issue that you got to get to. So this is another wake-up call about our vendor relationships, and particularly as we get into the software as a service world. We got to really watch that and build these things into our contracts.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up with that the executive order itself does have a lot of sections that I think are attempting to help with that, Dr. Anderson, right? It has in there about the common security language to be put into these contracts. And boy, there's a huge section. I can't remember if it's section 4 or something about all these requirements to be put on providers of IT services. So a lot's on the FAR Council right now. I think it's sitting with them, and they're trying to work their way through all these to get them out to be then, standard clauses that get put in contracts. But I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, all those things are big deals, but hopefully help is coming as a federal-wide effort, and it's going to then start being put in all these contracts. And of course, that's not a magic, that's not raising a magic wand, right? Just because it gets put into a contract. There's a lot of follow-up stuff to that then.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept of the SBOM, I think, is a very good one, right? And I know from looking at, again, some of our most recent threat research, we actually called out the need for DevOps and security teams and IT teams to gain visibility into the bill of materials of every cloud workload. And I think this is where we're going to see a very interesting intersection between what cloud is offering in terms of how modern cloud native applications are built, and as agencies start to move there, right? So the whole concept of the SBOM, I think the timing of it fits very well, right? So if you look at how modern apps are being built in the cloud, they're usually using a mix of containers, infrastructure as code, PaaS-based services. And the good thing is that all of those services can be defined in code. And what that means is that the configurations, since they're all in writing in the code, it is much more straightforward to understand the bill of materials, because cloud native applications are typically what we call declarative, simply meaning that the code expresses the intended function, and then this can be inspected from a security perspective. So I think, to Dr. Anderson's point too, about when you look at especially software that's delivered as SaaS, there is a large amount of implicit trust, right, that goes into those, right? Maybe you're relying upon a standard like an ISO 27000 or a FedRAMP or something like that, right? But I think what we're likely to see as some of the legislation and some of the rulings come out around the whole SBOM concept and the executive order, I think we're likely to see these things move into contracts and things like that. But certainly I can tell you from a threat research perspective and from a cloud native perspective, doing that type of thing is actually made much easier when you move towards cloud native applications, simply because of how they're written.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to move on to our next question, and to kick that one off as context, in a recent 42 Cloud Threat Report, researchers found that 91% of container images stored in public repositories contained at least one or more critical or high severity vulnerabilities. As containers are a technology that many agencies are adopting, and Dr. Anderson, maybe we'll start with you. Are there strategies that you've implemented or are looking to implement in order to address these types of supply chain threats?
This is the one question where this is probably you should start with somebody else, because
Sorry.
but not a lot of it. We are moving, so we, for the last 2 years, as part of our strategy is to move to the cloud, but to the extent possible, we're moving to software as a service and trying to do basically everything through software as a service, and very little of a platform, a platform of services, and almost nothing on the infrastructure as a service side, where we're actually orchestrating like what you're describing. And so it exists. We have some of it, but it's not a big issue, at least for us at the department, because we're not doing a lot of software development moving forward. We're getting away from doing custom development and really moving toward applications that are configurable for the Department of Commerce.
Well, thank you for your transparency. And Paul, what about over at DOL? Is that the case as well?
Well, we're not directly using container technology ourselves, but we certainly understand that probably our supply chain and cloud partners are. Looking at the question as, let's see, now as I'm pausing, look at my notes. Now it doesn't surprise. I was going to say it doesn't surprise me though that the threat report found 91% had one or more critical or high severity vulnerabilities. I wonder if you wouldn't find that in whatever cohort you were scanning, right? That there's going to be vulnerabilities found, and I wrote down that that's because cyber and IT itself are not set and forget, right? You can't just say, okay, well, I was secure on day X, therefore I'm going to be secure going forward. Next day, a vulnerability is found in something you've used in your many, many components you've put into your environment, and now there's a higher critical vulnerability on that. That's why transparency and visibility into the cyber posture enforced through, if it's a provider, through contract agreements on, how often they will scan for these, what time they will address them, and how they'll provide that information to the customer is so important, because this doesn't surprise me that 91% were found with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of a strategy, right? So, because I do know there are a number of agencies that are using containers. A great example is of kind of how to, I think, defend against these types of vulnerabilities that are being introduced through containers. If you look at what's been done within Department of Defense, they have their platform one, and specifically with their customer DevSecOps platform that's known as DSOP. Basically what it is, it's a collection of approved, hardened cloud native code books and containers. So in other words, it's a trusted registry. And DoD also has what they call Iron Bank, which is a repository of digitally signed containers. It's got both free open source software that's hardened to DoD standards. So instead of having developers or users just going out and downloading from public repositories, they know that if they download from Iron Bank or DSOP, they're going to get security by default. So this model, right, of having a trusted registry is most likely the best approach today for ensuring container security and also the resiliency of supply chains, as Paul mentioned, right? So even if agencies themselves may not be directly doing development on containers, I can assure you that the SaaS vendors that you're using to deliver things like 365, Salesforces, et cetera, the Snowflakes, behind the scenes, they're using containers.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and put up poll 2 next. Any second, there we go. Is your agency currently leveraging or planning to use Kubernetes or other cloud native architectures such as serverless functions in your modernization efforts? Okay, make sure to respond to that if you want to receive your CPE credit. And then we probably only have time for this one last question anyways, so I'll go ahead and read this one. Shifting security left is a concept that has been around for many years. However, as agencies move toward cloud and cloud native applications, it's quickly becoming a key security requirement in cloud deployments. So the question is, how are you currently approaching this or planning to approach this in your agency? And what are some key recommendations that you might make to your peers? Thoughts from the panelists? Dr. Anderson?
I'll start. I don't really think this is really new. It goes, to me, it follows the same principles of Agile. And that, when you are developing a product or service, you have, a team, a sprint, and you put everybody in the room. You want your CX, your UX developer in the room. You want your software developer in the room, your security engineer in the room. And they are contributing to the developing of this particular package or whatever you're developing, within that sprint. But they're all in the room. That the concept is you're putting everything up front, right? And so, of course, going back to the waterfall methodology, right? Where you build it, and then at the end of the process, we do a security scan, privacy impact assessment, get approved, and boom, you go into production, right? That's at the end of the process. But if we actually are truly, adopting Agile, then you're effectively moving security to the left, which we should be doing, bringing, and failing early, right? Just, I think Paul mentioned something about the fact that you're going to, it's an iterative process where things are going to be broken, fine one day and broken the next. But by bringing security in that Agile process, bringing it to the left, like Matt was, suggesting, then that's how you actually address that issue. So Agile principles themselves actually enable us to bring security to the left, in my mind.
Okay, and then I see Paul came off mute. Paul, or Matt, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a recommendations perspective, we've worked with a number of both federal and private customers as well around this. We generally recommend a at least from a strategic perspective, a 4-step approach to shifting left. And the first is really comes down to is education, right? So I think it was this past summer here in the US that the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or the CNCF, released a document around supply chain security best practices in the cloud. So we think that's a very good primer for both IT and security teams, development teams, to kind of get on the same page. So that's number one, is we'd recommend reading that document, making sure it's disseminated, and that'll give everybody kind of I think a level playing field, level of understanding. Number two is, well, in order to shift your security left, you need to actually have a shift left strategy. And shifting security left doesn't happen when you buy a security tool, right? It happens when you make it a strategic focus of your security program, right? It's got to be, as Dr. Anderson said, right? It has got to be something that is embedded, and it is something that if you were following agile development practices, will be much easier to do as you move toward that. Key things to include, right? If you are creating a shift left strategy as part of your overall security program, is to make sure it includes vision, ownership and responsibility, milestones, metrics. Those are all really key things. What I've often seen get agencies, let's just say, into issues down the road that could lead to breaches and things like that, is when there is unclear ownership and responsibility when you're moving into the cloud, right? Because if you are doing your own software development, the things that IT used to do on premise and that security used to do on premise, they're very different when you move to the cloud. So it's really important to have that understood. The third piece is really around looking, agency wide, and really trying to understand, again, if you are doing software development, or if you're relying on a third party to do it, is what does that flow of software look like? And this does get in a little bit to where the SBOM comes in. There's some portions of this here, but some key items to really include is to look at, who's developing the code. That's the people part. How it flows from development laptops into production. That's the process. And then identifying which systems they're using in order to enable that process. That's the technology. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as the CI/CD tool chain, but understanding all of that is really important. And the fourth step is really about quality assurance. So quality assurance has always been part of the software development lifecycle, but software quality has not historically included security. So every step of that process, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, is really an opportunity to give feedback and look for security issues. So those are generally kind of four principles, 4 ways, strategically that we look at for helping agencies to shift their security left.
Thank you, Matt. And Paul?
Yeah, here's the spice I'll add into this. It's imperative, though, on the security folks, if they're working in this development environment and doing security, being part of the team, but for security to understand the velocity that these things want to move at sometimes. And they may need to come up with new and innovative ways of doing the security validation that do not unduly add friction to the process. Because in general, the incentive is to get the updates out. And security cannot be the one who is always pointed at as being the one delaying the delivery of the product. So I'm not saying don't do security, and I'm not saying do it badly, but we do have a challenge, I think, in how do we make sure that we are not unduly delaying the process.
Excellent, thank you all. And we're gonna go ahead and post our third and final poll question, or excuse me, there will actually be one more right after this, which we'll also post. Has your agency begun to shift left in its cloud deployments? Please answer yes, no, or you're unsure. And then in a second, we'll post our final poll question. And this one is just, would you like a CPE credit certification emailed to you? So we'll post that in just a minute. And then with less than 10 minutes on the clock, I'd love to go around and just do some takeaways. So whatever you want to leave our audience with, whether it be something you learned here today, something that really stood out to you, or something that you really want our audience to walk away having better understood. So we'll go ahead and we'll begin with Dr. Anderson, please.
So I think if, coming away from this conversation, I would say this, about everything. It's really about governance and investment and strategy. Technically, there will be plenty of vendors who want to talk to you and talk to me about technology. But until we get our act together across, particularly for a large organization, you really got to get your act together and building this, and embedding this into your organization. Just the same would be true for moving security to the left. It's about this is who you have to be, who you are, and what you do. And if it's not going to be that, you're not going to be able to sustain this, zero trust. So you're not going to be able to sustain any large scale initiative or large scale change initiative. So if you don't build into your organization as a part of what you do, then you're doomed for at least long-term failure. You may have some short-term successes, but we want to be able to sustain something like this.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you on the panel. And Paul, what would your takeaway for our audience be?
Well, I think first I'd have something for them to take away from my perspective on this is that while I, like many others, may have, when I first read the executive order, gone, now what are we going to have to do? Is when you start peeling it back, it really does provide a lot of tools for enabling advancement and success. And I know that one of the audience members brought up about, well, what does this do for BYOD and remote work? And we were having an internal discussion amongst some of our IT folks this other day. And I said, take the executive order and find out where it benefits us, right? And also look for those opportunities where it not benefits IT, but benefits the Department of Labor and allows IT to enable that mission better through application of the executive order, because there are numerous opportunities there, if you look at it that way, of providing better service to the American public. And my takeaway was, I do have still a lot to learn, especially in the areas of DevSecOps and things. What Matt was saying, I was scribbling down notes. I'm like, okay, well, that's something to look into. That's something to look into. It's not something I learned today. I continually learn it, how little I know. So that's a hallmark of a good leader, realizing that there's always something to learn, right? So, and I'll make sure Paul and Dr. Anderson, I'll get you guys a copy of our latest cloud threat report. And of course, if any of our viewers today would want to download that, you can just go to cloudthreat.report. If you just put that in your browser, cloudthreat.report, that'll take you right to the site where you can download a full copy of the latest threat research. But what I would say is just that, hackers are
attackers, they're always opportunistic, right? They are looking for the weakest link. And although SolarWinds has received probably more headlines than any other breach and supply chain attack in history, there have been many others like it over the years. This is not the first time. Cloud comes into play here because that's where, quite frankly, many organizations are moving, and many of them are not yet at that point of maturity where they're keeping their cloud workload secure. And oftentimes, as I mentioned before, they're heavily relying on open source software, which is, as we know, not always the most secure. So the bottom line here, I'll reiterate, is that if you're operating in the cloud, if you're doing software development, it is absolutely critical that you get visibility into the bill of materials of every cloud workload. And unfortunately, you can't depend upon the same sets of tools and processes that you used in your on-prem data centers to do that. It is different when you move to the cloud.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure. There's our last CPE credit poll question. Please make sure that if you answered all 3 of them today, you respond to this so we know if we should email them to you or not. And on that note, I would like to thank our partners again at Palo Alto Networks and all of our amazing panelists. Thank you all at home for joining us as well and sending in your audience questions. It definitely helped make for a great conversation. And we hope to see you at ATARC's next event, which is on Tuesday, January 18th. So you can go register for that. We've got a great lineup for that one as well. And I look forward to speaking with you all again soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.